Okay, hello and welcome to week 31 for Functional Skills English. This week is all about the reading revision and feedback based on the assessments that you guys did before half term. So, as always, we've got some warm-up questions there on the screen. Give yourself around 4 to 5 minutes to have a little look through those, have a go at those on pen and paper, or jot them down on a Word document. Pause the video now to do that, and I'm going to go through it in just a moment for you. So pause now to give yourself a chance to have a go. Okay, so we're looking at this first sentence. We're looking at question number 1. And the question is that a sentence, is it a compound or a complex sentence? So if you remember, a compound sentence is one of those sentences that is made up of two smaller sentences. Those parts could be broken off. They could work as a small, complete idea on their own. And when we have a compound sentence, we join those together using a comma and a joining word, a conjunction, in the middle. A complex sentence, if you remember, is where we have a main sort of sentence that makes sense on its own, and we're adding extra information to it, and that extra information does not work as a sentence on its own. So bearing that in mind, if we look at this example here, I wanted to go sightseeing. Well, that makes sense on its own, doesn't it? It works as a sentence on its own. If we look over here at the other side, despite all of the travelling, that doesn't quite work on its own. And that's because of this sneaky word here, the word despite. It makes it sound like there is more information to come. And there is. So we can think of this as extra information that we're adding onto the main sentence. We use that comma in the middle to join that extra information to the main sentence. So that makes this a complex sentence. There we go. Question number 2 then, which of these words is not a conjunction? Which of these is not a joining word? That is in fact this one here in the middle, etc. So etc is actually short for a French phrase, etc. And that is to mean and so on. So when we are listing things, but actually the list keeps going and it's getting so long, we're lazy, we don't want to carry on writing it or saying it, we use etc or etc at the end of that list. So it comes towards the end of a sentence. It doesn't work as a joining word in the middle of a sentence. Some people might have looked at this one at the end and thought, oh, that one's not a joining word. Nor is actually a joining word, but it's quite old-fashioned. We don't use it very often anymore. When we do use it, we're using it to talk about options, a bit like or, but we talk about them in a negative way. So, for example, I didn't go to the shops, nor did I go to Costa. So I'm using it when I'm talking in a negative way. So, question number 3 then, where do or does the commas need to go to show extra information? Well, this is a sneaky one. The extra information in our sentence is actually in the middle. It's not at the end, it's not at the beginning, it's in the middle. And if we are in this situation where we have extra information that is sort of buried within the middle of the sentence, not only do we need a comma at the end of that extra information, we need a comma at the start as well. You've got to imagine that if we took that extra information away, if we broke it off and took it away, what is left would still make sense. So Anya wore a woolly jumper would still work as a small sentence on its own. It's a complete piece of information. Let's look at number 4 then. So what we've got here, we've actually got a lot of things going on. First of all, there is no full stop at the end of the sentence. But if we read it through, there's so many parts there that could work as little sentences on their own. The manager went to get the chef. That could work as a little sentence on its own. He refused to talk to yous. Refused to talk to us, maybe. and then I demanded my money back. So we've got 3 bits that would work as small sentences on their own. The first 2 have got a potential joining word here in the middle, this but. It's not quite right because it's missing the comma there, so we need to add that comma in, but we can leave that as a compound sentence. We can leave that. But we've got 2 sort of sentences here, sort of sitting side by side. They're not separated and they're not joined properly. So there's a couple of things that we could do. The best piece of advice I would give you as well is to only have one joining word in a sentence. So if we're going to keep this joining word here, it's a good idea that we put a full stop here and end it. We could put another joining word in here and a comma to join on this last sort of chunk. But if we have too many joining words in a sentence, it starts to get a bit messy. It starts to get a bit difficult to understand. So it's probably better that we put a full stop there and just have a lovely, short, sharp, simple sentence there. Last but not least then, so question number 5, where would you avoid putting a comma in a list of items or things? So if we are writing a list, we use a comma between every item except for the last 2 items, because we use either the word and or the word or. It already does that job for us and separates those items. So we don't need a comma as well. Okay then, guys. So let's move on. Let's have a little chat about today. So as I said a few minutes ago, it's all about feedback and revision on those reading assessments that you did. For your specific personal feedback on your assessment, you will need to go to the assessment on Learn where you were before and make sure you click on the right level for you. You will be able to see your assessment and there will be an option that says review feedback. You will be able to click on that and get your personal feedback. Double check with your tutor if you're not sure what level. And they might even be able to send you a direct link if you ask them nicely. So, plan of action for today. We're going to consider some very general feedback, and this is general feedback for sort of across the board. This isn't for everyone, but certain parts might be relevant to you. And then based on that feedback, there's a couple of areas that we're going to talk about and that we're going to revise today, such as language features. I know a lot of people still feel a bit uncomfortable with those. And again, we're going to use our inference skills to really zero in and focus in on what a writer really means by certain quotes. So here's some feedback. Some learners were struggling to identify language techniques. Now, what we mean by this is the horrible language techniques question. Some of you were pulling out some really good quotes and examples from the texts, but weren't giving us the label or the name of the technique being used. So as an examiner, we couldn't give you the mark because we don't know what language technique you're trying to show us. On occasion, students were also were giving us some labels, were giving us some names of the techniques, but weren't quite matching up to the quote, to the example that they'd given. So a little bit of a refresher, a little bit of a reminder on those today is coming up, and some resources that you can use to sort of revise at your own pace as well. Learners were often vague when explaining quotes. So where the questions give you an example from the text, and we have to really sort of kind of drill down and explain what the writer was saying and what they meant. Sometimes we weren't focusing on the quote as a whole. We might have been focusing on one word and sort of explaining what that one word meant. And sometimes we weren't sort of linking it back to the question. And I'll show you a little bit more about what I mean by that in a few minutes. A couple of sort of easy ones to act on here, ones that perhaps we just weren't aware of before we went into that assessment. Certain questions will ask you to give a particular number of answers. So they might ask you for 1 idea or 2 reasons or 3 examples for instance. And some learners were sort of trying to cover all bases, and they were looking for all the correct answers they could find in the text, and there's usually more than the amount they are after. And if you give me more answers than what the question is asking you to provide, we run the risk of losing marks. And I know that sounds unfair, and I know that sounds a bit silly, especially if all those answers are correct. But the way the examiner will see it is that you are hedging your bets, that you are trying to cover all bases to pick as many marks up as possible, but that perhaps you are guessing because you're not quite sure. Okay, and that you haven't read that question properly. So please be very, very aware of that. Read those questions as carefully as possible. It might be worth just slowing down, having a little check through at the end to make sure that you've given the amount of answers that they are looking for. Okay. Last but not least, then, as well, the topics that you encounter in these texts might be very familiar. So things like social media, things like college and study, things like jobs, it might also be relevant to particular careers or groups or hobbies or pastimes. You might already have a good understanding of that topic from the real world. And that's okay, but we've got to be very, very careful because certain questions are after you taking your answers directly from the text. Remember, it's a reading test, so they are testing your ability to read that text, take the information from that text, and pick out what you need to answer the questions. And a lot of them are copy and paste, where we're taking those words directly from the text. We need to avoid trying to put things in our own words, and we need to avoid using our own personal knowledge of a topic, because although it might answer the question in the real world, it isn't showing the examiner that you can pick out what you need to from that text. So when you give your answers, they have got to come from that text. They can't come from what you already know. And again, if you reword things slightly, it might appear that you are taking that information from somewhere else rather than directly from the text. So do be careful. Those are all things that we can definitely work on. So let's get started. In lesson, we would be annotating on the screen. But for me, on a Word document, can you write down what you think a quotation is? Okay, so explain to me in your own words what a quotation is, and can you think of any other sort of wording that the questions in the exam might use when they want one of these? So I'll give you just a moment to do that. Please pause the video if you want to. So a quotation is the words that someone has directly said. So it might be what they have said out loud, in which case we would see speech marks, or it might be the words that they have written in their text. Either way, a quotation is it's a small chunk that we take from that text of words of what that writer has personally directly said. We don't change the words, we go with what they have said. Some questions in the exam will ask you to give a quotation, so you are having to go and pick one out yourself. And they might also use other words such as example or evidence to mean the same thing, in that you need to go to the text and pick out word for word your chunk from the text to answer that question. In some cases, it works the other way round. In this case, I'll show you in fact. In this case, the examiner, or exam paper even, has given you some examples from the text. And these aren't very long, they're usually 2, 3, 4 words at most, but we need to be very careful. This is a case of where we need to now put it into our own words. So we need to kind of avoid using the same wording that we see in the quote, because that doesn't really help us to make a clear kind of explanation. So if we just focus on this one, apologies guys. if we focus on this one at the bottom, the moderate intensity one, on one level, it's kind of a couple of layers to this kind of question. On one level, I need to kind of explain what both of these words really mean, but I need to do it in a different way. I need to think of perhaps different words than what is being used here. For instance, if I said to you, what does moderate mean? If you turned around and said, well, it's moderate, Gabby, that doesn't really help me to understand what it means. So I need to try and explain what these two words mean. So moderate is sort of in the middle, it's kind of a medium amount. And intensity can be an amount of effort or input of something. So I'd say a sort of a medium effort. That's my first level, my first layer. I've also got to think about and link it to this part of the question. So it might help me to go back to the part of the text that this quote is in and reread the sentence or maybe even the paragraph that it is in to kind of get a feel for what the writer is trying to say. It's all about the writer's view, so how they feel about the topic, so how they feel about this topic here of walking. So if they are saying that walking can be of a moderate intensity, to me that comes across that it's a medium amount of effort activity or exercise maybe. So I would take that sort of second step and try and link this back to what is being talked about in the question. So we have to be as specific as possible. We can't be too vague. We can't be too general. That question is going to link it to something, and we can't ignore that. Otherwise, we might not pick up the marks. So it's your turn. You're going to have a go at this. Okay, if I can just clear my page, obviously. You're going to have a go at this in a moment. You need to Learn, come to the folder, and you will need to open text A. We're going to read text A together. It's an online discussion all about virtual reality. And the first person, Molly, is saying, I keep hearing about virtual reality or VR being used in homes, schools, hospitals, and even to travel in space. Why on earth is it suddenly so popular? Eric says VR used to be for IT experts only, but now ordinary people are enjoying it too. All you need is a headset and you're ready to go. This means that different experiences, scenarios, and places can be explored using VR. Sanjay agrees. He says, I agree with Eric and think it's brilliant that school children can use VR in a variety of subjects at school, so their school lessons come alive. Pupils can visit the Taj Mahal, go underwater, and climb mountains. I'm really tempted to get a VR headset and try it for myself. Have you tried it yet, Molly? So Molly is responding, no, I haven't, and although I understand that it's good for educational and professional purposes, I don't want a future filled with half-awake humans living in a fantasy world. You can already see the negative effects the internet and smartphones have on our ability to communicate in real life. I dread the day when people only talk in text speak and act like robots because they're all plugged into a virtual life. So Eric responds again, I read a newspaper article that showed playing computer games helps us process information up to 15 times more quickly. So imagine how much VR will improve our abilities. Soon it will be simple to visit faraway places such as the Great Wall of China from the comfort of an armchair. The tide has turned and VR has a great future ahead. So why not greet it with a hello and a headset? Sanjay also responds again, I completely understand your mixed feelings, Molly, but I think the future of VR looks fantastic. It offers so many positive possibilities and will benefit us in ways we can't imagine yet. I hope you get to try it soon and find out for yourself. So underneath the text, we have got two quotations, two examples that have been picked out from this text. They are from two different speakers, so two different people in that conversation, and they have very different views on VR. The first one we're just going to take that step of trying to explain those words on a basic level. So where it says half awake humans, I want you to try and explain what that writer means. So when they're talking about these humans that are using VR or technology of any kind, what does she really mean by that? If you can try and explain to me in your own words. Then the next one is a quote, I think from Eric. It says, "The tide has turned." On one level, what do we mean by that phrase? We use that in our everyday language. So what does that really mean? Then take that second step, go back, look at the sentence that it's in. How does Eric feel about VR technology? When he's saying the tide has turned, is it positive? Is it negative? Have a think. How does he really feel? So take that second step and be really, really specific. So give yourselves a few moments to do that. Pause the video now. Okay, so if we are going to look at these examples, let's look at them together. So half awake humans, what do we really mean by that? Well, it kind of implies, it suggests that people aren't really aware, they're not really focusing on the world around them, they're only sort of focusing on the virtual reality or the online reality, and they're not really sort of aware of their surroundings or the real world. When we talk about the tide has turned, the tide has turned is a phrase that we use to show that something has changed, it's changed dramatically and potentially changing for the better. In this case. So when we link it back to that particular writer's view, he's very positive about VR, and he's trying to show that it's a positive step forward. Things are changing and changing for the better. We've done quite a bit on quotations there, so let's move on. Let's talk about language techniques now. So instead of me just sitting here talking to you, telling you all about the fear techniques, we've gone over those time and time again. You know what they are. So what you will need to do, just to give yourself a bit of a recap and a reminder, if you come on to learn, have a little look, I'll show you in the folder. There is an activity here, it's called the Fear Techniques Revision Activity. When you click on this, it will take you over to a word wall activity. And what you've got here, you've got some different techniques down the left hand side, and you've got some descriptions of what they are, just to give you a bit of a reminder. So have a play around with that activity for me. Once you've done that, there is also a revision video. So depending on how you got on, this video talks about some alternative techniques that do come up in the reading exams as well as the fear ones. It talks about those first, and we're going to watch that in just a moment. But afterwards, after I pause it, there is also revision and recap on the fear techniques as well if you need it. So I have put that into the folder here if you want to come and have a look at that just for a bit of revision. So bear with me, guys. Let me make sure that it's sharing my sound. And I'll just play the video for you. I'm recording. Okay. Thank you. Okay, guys, so my video is not catching up. Oh, it's not catching up. Give it a moment. Okay, so there we go. Techniques. Language techniques. go. To get you thinking about those techniques as well, we are going to sort of put that into practice with an activity down here. You can see it's at the bottom here. It says recognizing language techniques in texts. Now that is actually linking to the text we have already read, that online discussion forum about virtual reality. And it is a drag and drop activity. So you've already got the names of some different language techniques that are in there. You've got to play around and work out which ones are being used where. So it's over to you. Use your knowledge, have a little practice, see how you get on with that. And once you've done that, we're going to sort of just come to the end of the session. If I bring us back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so bear with me a moment, guys, because we've talked about all these things. So this is our last thing that I want you to do. At the bottom of that document where you have looked at the text and you've answered those questions on the quotations, I'd like you to answer these 3 questions. So in your own words, please explain what you think, what are the steps? What do you need to do when you are explaining a quotation? I'd like you to pick one language feature you can remember and explain in your own words to me what it is. And last but not least, I want you to come up with one sort of tip or hint or piece of advice for someone taking their reading exam. Now, please remember to email all work that you have done to your tutor. And if you've got any questions, again, drop them a message either on Learn or via email. Thanks, guys. See you again.